May 2012, Quebec, Canada, 5:03 a.m. A convoy of police vehicles rolled silently into the street without sirens. Car doors opened one after another. Men dressed in black tactical gear quickly spread around the house at the end of the block. One team moved toward the back entrance. Another advanced toward the front door. Every officer wore body armor, carried rifles, and moved with the kind of precision that only came from rehearsing the operation repeatedly beforehand. Inside the house, Frank Barasa was asleep beside his girlfriend. He had no idea that more than 30 law enforcement officers were preparing to force their way inside. One officer raised a hand signal. The battering ram slammed into the front door. The sound exploded through the silent neighborhood. "Police, get down!" Frank jolted awake in panic. Before he could fully understand what was happening, heavy boots were already pounding up the wooden staircase. Seconds later, the bedroom door burst open. Flashlights blasted directly into his face. Frank's girlfriend screamed as armed officers flooded into the room. "Hands up! Get on the ground now!" Within seconds, Frank was dragged out of bed, forced face first onto the floor, and handcuffed behind his back. He was barely awake, but he already understood one thing. It was over. As officers escorted Frank outside, his girlfriend tried to move toward him but was stopped by police. She had no idea what was happening. To her, Frank was simply a successful businessman. He had money, expensive cars, private business projects he rarely talked about in detail. Nothing about his life suggested the existence of a massive criminal operation hidden behind the scenes. Inside the garage, investigators discovered large industrial printing equipment. Not home printers. Industrial-grade offset machines normally found inside professional commercial printing facilities. Nearby sat paper-cutting machines, drying systems, and rows of printing materials organized with almost obsessive precision. Investigators then moved into the basement. There, they discovered stacks of security paper sealed inside large storage boxes. Some containers held bundles of US $20 bills wrapped carefully in plastic. Counterfeit currency. Huge amounts of counterfeit currency. Investigators quickly performed a rough count. The amount recovered at the scene alone approached $1 million. But that was only the beginning. Inside a drawer near the bedroom, officers also located a small quantity of marijuana. One investigator sealed it into an evidence bag. Frank sat handcuffed in the back of a police vehicle. He didn't look at the officers surrounding the scene. He only looked back toward the house. His girlfriend stood frozen near the doorway, still struggling to understand what she was seeing. Frank watched her silently for a few seconds before finally turning away. The man sitting in the back of that police car was named Frank Barasa. And at the moment of his arrest, investigators believed he was responsible for a counterfeit operation connected to nearly $250 million in fake U.S. currency circulating throughout Canada and the United States. What made the case extraordinary wasn't just the scale. It was the quality. The counterfeit bills produced by Frank were sophisticated enough to pass many standard counterfeit detection systems. Some Secret Service investigators later admitted the notes ranked among the most dangerous super notes they had ever encountered. But what made the story even more unsettling was who Frank Barasa actually was. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't connected to a cartel. He didn't come from street gangs or organized crime families. Frank had once been a legitimate businessman. He had earned money legally, built a normal life. And that was exactly what made the story more disturbing than most counterfeit cases. Because everything began with one very simple idea. Frank Barasa didn't want to spend the rest of his life working endlessly just to make money. So he decided to find a shortcut. Before becoming the target of an international counterfeit investigation involving hundreds of millions of dollars in fake U.S. currency, Frank Barasa lived a very different life. He was a legitimate businessman operating in Canada. Frank worked in the automotive brake pad industry and had spent years building his own company from the ground up. He understood how businesses operated, knew how to negotiate with clients, and had extensive experience managing manufacturing and production systems. People who knew Frank during that period generally saw him as an ordinary businessman. He dressed professionally, spoke calmly, and carried himself more like a corporate executive than someone who would eventually run a massive criminal operation. For years, the business provided Frank with a stable and comfortable income. He owned a house, drove expensive cars, and appeared to have built the kind of life many people worked decades to achieve. But behind that image was a schedule dominated almost entirely by work. Frank often started his days early in the morning and didn't leave the factory until late at night. At times, he spent most of his waking hours inside the production facility, overseeing manufacturing problems and handling business operations. After years of living that way, he began growing exhausted with a life centered entirely around work. Frank realized he had sacrificed an enormous amount of time just to reach financial stability. Eventually, he sold the company for a substantial profit. For the first time in years, Frank suddenly had free time. And that was when his thinking began to change. At first, his interests focused on investments and finance. But over time, his attention shifted towards something far more dangerous: counterfeit money. Frank became fascinated with how U.S. currency was manufactured. He studied printing technology, researched famous counterfeiting cases, and closely examined the smallest details on American $20 bills. What caught his attention most was the fact that money operated differently from almost every other product in the world. A normal business has to advertise, compete for customers, and convince people to buy what it sells. Money doesn't. Almost everyone accepts it automatically. Slowly, Frank began viewing currency as a unique kind of product. The deeper he researched counterfeit operations, the more he noticed a recurring pattern. Most counterfeiters were caught because the quality of their product was terrible. Many relied on consumer printers and ordinary paper, making the fake bills easy to detect. Frank approached the problem differently. He carefully studied the structure of U.S. currency, the ink composition, hidden security features, watermarks, and UV reactions. During that process, he discovered something critical. The hardest part of reproducing U.S. currency wasn't the artwork printed on the bill. It was the paper itself. Authentic U.S. currency is printed on a specialized cotton-linen blend containing multiple embedded security features. That was why most counterfeit money failed almost immediately under professional inspection. That discovery pushed Frank toward a far more dangerous line of thinking. Instead of trying to imitate the paper, what if he could somehow gain access to material close to the kind used for real currency production? That idea slowly became the foundation for everything that followed. From that point forward, Frank was no longer simply curious about printing technology. He had started preparing for a large-scale criminal operation that would eventually draw the attention of the United States Secret Service. After realizing that the biggest weakness in most counterfeit operations was the quality of the paper itself, Frank Barasa became obsessed with researching companies that manufactured security-grade paper. He studied technical documents, learned how banks and financial institutions ordered anti-counterfeit materials, and carefully documented the specifications commonly used in the bond and securities printing industry. Frank understood something immediately. If he directly asked for currency paper, suspicion would come instantly. So he built an entirely different story. Frank created the identity of a financial industry representative, preparing to launch high-security investment bonds intended for international transactions. It was a legitimate type of product that often required many of the same anti-counterfeit features used in paper currency. Before contacting suppliers, Frank prepared obsessively. He drafted technical specifications in advance, practiced how he would speak during phone calls, and memorized industry terminology to make himself sound like someone with real experience in financial printing. Then, in late 2008, Frank made what would become the most important phone call of the entire operation. He contacted a company specializing in security paper manufacturing and introduced himself as a representative of a private investment corporation. During the conversation, Frank requested paper containing a cotton linen composition, material that would not react abnormally under UV light, and the ability to integrate watermarks and embedded security strips. The exact same features used in real currency. What made the situation even more dangerous was that the request itself did not immediately appear suspicious to the manufacturer. Legitimate financial products often used similar anti-counterfeit technologies. When the supplier asked about the watermark design, Frank submitted a portrait of Andrew Jackson, the same face printed on the US $20 bill. but Frank never described it as American currency artwork. Instead, he claimed it was the founder of his company and explained that the portrait would serve as a branding element embedded inside the security paper. The entire exchange went surprisingly smoothly. Throughout the call, Frank kept his tone calm and professional, even though he understood he was moving dangerously close to serious federal crimes. Once he received the pricing information, Frank accepted almost immediately. He spent tens of thousands of dollars ordering a large quantity of industrial-grade security paper. According to his calculations, the shipment would be enough to print hundreds of millions of dollars in counterfeit currency. Several months later, a container carrying the paper was shipped to Canada. That was the moment Frank became genuinely nervous for the first time. If customs officers inspected the shipment too carefully, the operation could collapse before it even began. On paper, the transaction was technically legal. But importing massive amounts of security-grade paper containing watermark features similar to U.S. currency could easily trigger suspicion from authorities. The day the shipping container arrived at the port, Frank personally drove to the customs area to watch from a distance. He sat inside his vehicle for hours holding binoculars, monitoring every movement made by customs officers inspecting incoming cargo. At one point, the container was temporarily pulled aside for document verification. Frank barely looked away from the inspection area. One customs officer picked up the paperwork and read the product description aloud. Security paper. For a brief moment, Frank believed the entire operation was over. But after several tense minutes, the container was finally cleared and released. Frank exhaled in relief. He knew he had just survived one of the most dangerous moments since the beginning of the counterfeit operation. After the shipment of security paper safely cleared the port, Frank Barasa transported the entire load to a warehouse he had rented in Quebec under the name of a shell company. Even then, he remained extremely cautious. Before opening the container, Frank used signal detection equipment to check whether the shipment had been fitted with any tracking devices. He understood that if authorities had already grown suspicious, the entire operation could have been monitored from the moment the cargo entered Canada. Only after multiple scans revealed nothing unusual did Frank finally authorize the container to be opened. Inside were carefully packaged rolls of industrial-grade security paper. Frank lifted individual sheets toward the light, inspecting the watermark placement and embedded security strips. When he tested the material under UV light, the reaction looked remarkably close to genuine U.S. currency. That was the moment Frank truly began believing the operation could work. But obtaining the paper was only the beginning. To create counterfeit currency capable of surviving banks and professional detection systems, Frank needed to build a fully functioning print operation. He started purchasing equipment in small batches to avoid attracting attention. Machines were ordered from multiple suppliers and transported to the warehouse through separate delivery methods. Over the following months, Frank assembled the entire counterfeit production system himself. Gradually, the warehouse filled with industrial offset printing machines, paper cutting equipment, drying systems, color calibration stations, and print processing tools. The equipment was nearly identical to what legitimate commercial printing companies used every day. Frank wasn't operating like ordinary counterfeit crews using desktop printers and cheap materials. He was building something much closer to a real industrial print facility. To finalize the bill designs, Frank hired a graphic designer to help create digital production files. He falsely claimed the project was connected to the film industry and required highly realistic prop money for movie production. The designer never understood the true purpose behind the project. Frank spent countless hours studying every detail of the US $20 bill, the color tones, image sharpness, ink layering, surface texture, UV reactions, security strip placement, and the hidden watermark embedded inside the paper. He constantly compared test prints against genuine currency using magnifying lenses and specialized inspection lights. Many of the early print attempts failed completely. Some had incorrect color balance. Others suffered from alignment problems. A few bills passed basic visual inspection but revealed flaws immediately under UV light or high magnification. Frank destroyed large numbers of defective prints to reduce the risk of discovery. During this period, Most of his life revolved entirely around a warehouse. He practically lived beside the printing equipment, continuously adjusting settings and refining techniques to improve quality. Frank experimented with multiple ink combinations, attempting to recreate the color shifting effect on the number 20 printed on genuine US currency. At the time, it was considered one of the hardest security features to duplicate. He also tried replicating the slightly raised texture found on Andrew Jackson's portrait, an effect created on authentic currency through specialized intaglio printing methods used by the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing. The testing phase lasted for months, and the closer Frank came to the results he wanted, the more convinced he became that he could produce counterfeit currency far beyond the quality of ordinary criminal operations. By early 2009, after months of non-stop testing inside a warehouse in Quebec, Frank Barasa was finally closing in on the goal he had obsessed over from the very beginning. Dozens of failed prints had already been destroyed. A minor flaw in the ink, a misplaced watermark, or the wrong reaction under UV light was enough to ruin the entire operation. Frank understood something most counterfeiters never fully grasped. Fake money only survives if it can move through the real world unnoticed. It had to pass cashiers, counterfeit detectors, convenience store clerks, and eventually the banking system itself. If it failed at any point, everything he had built would collapse. 4 weeks at a time, Frank barely left the warehouse. He practically lived beside the printing equipment, constantly adjusting color tones, sharpening details, and experimenting with the way the ink bonded to the paper. One of the biggest challenges was recreating the color-shifting 20 on the US bill. Genuine currency used specialized ink that changed from copper to green depending on the angle of the light. Frank had no access to the original formula used by the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing. So he improvised. Using different commercial ink combinations, he worked relentlessly to create something close enough to fool the human eye. But color alone wasn't enough. He also became obsessed with replicating the subtle raised texture on Andrew Jackson's portrait. Real U.S. currency has a rough tactile feel created through an advanced printing process that most counterfeit operations could never imitate convincingly. Night after night, Frank sat under harsh inspection lights comparing his test prints against authentic $20 bills through magnifying lenses. Every line, every shadow, every microscopic detail. He wasn't trying to fool average people anymore. His goal was far bigger than that. Frank wanted counterfeit bills good enough to survive inside the real financial system. Then, sometime in March 2009, after months of failures, he picked up a print that made him stop cold. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. This time, the bill looked almost perfect. The colors were nearly identical to genuine currency. The watermark appeared exactly where it should under direct light. The embedded security strip reacted almost like the real thing under UV inspection. Even the color-shifting 20 worked surprisingly well. Frank then grabbed a counterfeit detection pin and drew a line across the surface of the paper. The reaction matched authentic US currency. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, he drove to a quiet gas station a few miles from the warehouse. He intentionally chose late-night hours when there would be fewer customers and less chance of attracting attention. Frank walked into the convenience store, grabbed a pack of gum, and handed the freshly printed $20 bill to the cashier. It was the most tense moment of the entire operation so far. The cashier lifted the bill beneath the overhead light. She checked the watermark, ran her fingers lightly across the surface, then placed it on the counter for a few seconds before reaching for the register. Frank stood there silently, watching every movement she made. If the bill was exposed as fake, the operation could end right there. But after a few long seconds, the cashier accepted the money and handed back real change like it was just another routine transaction. Frank walked out of the store, holding genuine cash in his hand. For the first time, a counterfeit bill produced by his operation had successfully entered circulation. That moment changed everything. Frank no longer saw the project as a private experiment. From that point forward, he started thinking bigger, scaling production, increasing volume, and moving counterfeit currency into circulation on a much larger level. But to do that, he needed one more critical piece: a distribution network inside the criminal underworld. After successfully putting the first counterfeit bill into circulation, Frank Barasa realized that printing the money had only solved half the problem. The harder part was moving large amounts of counterfeit cash into the market without personally spending it himself. If Frank kept passing fake bills at stores and gas stations on his own, surveillance cameras and investigators would eventually trace the activity back to him. He needed a professional distribution network. And that meant stepping into a world he had never truly belonged to before. For years, Frank had lived as a businessman. He was used to client meetings, contracts, negotiations, and operating inside legitimate corporate environments. Now, the people he needed to deal with were drug traffickers, gang members, and intermediaries tied to organized crime groups. The first meeting took place in a parking lot outside Montreal sometime in late 2009. Frank arrived dressed like an ordinary businessman, polo shirt, khaki pants, nothing flashy. He looked more like someone heading to a sales meeting than a man about to negotiate a criminal transaction. The men waiting for him looked very different. Heavy tattoos, large chains, hard expressions. Every movement carried visible suspicion. Frank immediately realized he was the outsider in that parking lot. Still, he kept his voice calm and controlled, treating the conversation like any other business deal. His offer was straightforward: $100,000 in counterfeit currency in exchange for roughly $30,000 in real cash. For criminal groups involved in money laundering, narcotics, or black market operations, the profit potential was enormous, assuming the bills were good enough to survive circulation. At first, the buyers were skeptical. They had seen plenty of low-quality counterfeit money before, and they understood exactly what could happen if fake bills were detected during a transaction. One man in the group looked directly at Frank and made the warning clear. If the money turned out to be bad, they would come back looking for him. Frank didn't argue. Instead, he handed over sample bills and allowed them to test the currency themselves. Over the following days, the counterfeit cash was tested in multiple locations: convenience stores, casinos, banks, and automated change machines. The results exceeded expectations. Most of the transactions went through without problems. Word spread quickly through Canada's criminal underground that someone had access to an unusually high-quality source of counterfeit U.S. currency. Soon, Frank began receiving offers from multiple criminal groups interested in working with him. From that point on, the warehouse operation in Quebec barely stopped running. Frank hired additional workers to help cut, package, and transport the counterfeit money. The bills were bundled into tightly wrapped stacks identical to the way real banks processed cash. Each package typically contained around $10,000 in $20 bills. Frank managed the entire operation like a legitimate company. The process was divided into separate stages. Quality control was checked constantly. Consistency became an obsession. Ironically, the same business experience that once helped him run a brake pad company was now helping him operate one of the most sophisticated counterfeit operations in North America. Within less than 2 years, counterfeit bills produced inside the Quebec warehouse had begun appearing across both Canada and the United States. The fake 20s surfaced in gas stations, supermarkets, casinos, and retail stores, often without immediate detection. The money flowing back to Frank increased rapidly. According to later investigative documents, he eventually earned far more from counterfeit currency than he ever made running his legitimate business. But the growing profits came with growing pressure. Frank slowly began changing his daily routines. While driving, he constantly checked his rearview mirror. He paid attention to unfamiliar vehicles parked near his home. He became increasingly careful about discussing work around other people. Even though investigators had not officially targeted him yet, Frank understood something important. An operation this large would eventually attract attention. The same path he once believed would free him from financial pressure and years of hard work was now turning into something else entirely. Between 2010 and 2011, the number of counterfeit $20 bills appearing across Canada and the United States began rising sharply. At first, most banks and retail stores treated the incidents as isolated cases. Counterfeit currency had always existed at some level in circulation, and fake bills were nothing new to investigators. But forensic examiners quickly noticed something unusual about these particular notes. The paper quality was exceptionally high. The watermark appeared in the correct position. The embedded security strip reacted almost exactly like genuine U.S. currency under UV light. Even the physical feel of the bills made them difficult to distinguish during routine inspections. Many of the counterfeit 20s successfully passed store-level detection machines and were only identified later after reaching banks or advanced forensic labs. That was when the operation started drawing the attention of the United States Secret Service, the federal agency responsible for investigating counterfeit U.S. currency. Counterfeit samples recovered from multiple states were sent to forensic specialists for analysis. Inside the lab, investigators used microscopes and specialized imaging equipment to compare the fake notes against authentic U.S. currency. One examiner noticed a subtle flaw in the ink surrounding Andrew Jackson's portrait. On genuine currency, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing used an advanced intaglio printing process that caused the ink to sit deep within the paper fibers while creating a raised texture. The counterfeit bills, despite being extremely sophisticated, behaved slightly differently under high magnification. The ink rested on the surface in a way that only trained forensic specialists could detect. It was the kind of flaw ordinary people would never notice. Very quickly, the counterfeit notes were classified as supernotes, a term used for high-end counterfeit currency capable of defeating most routine detection methods. What worried investigators most wasn't just the quality. It was the scale. The counterfeit bills were surfacing across multiple regions, yet they all shared nearly identical characteristics. That strongly suggested they were coming from a single large production source, rather than several unrelated counterfeit crews. While federal investigators worked to trace the origin of the supernotes, Frank Barasa continued operating the print facility in Quebec. He followed news reports about counterfeit investigations with growing attention. Frank understood something critical. Once the Secret Service became involved, exposure was no longer a question of if, only when. But the profits had become too large to walk away from immediately. Frank continued accepting orders from criminal distributors across the underground market. Inside the warehouse, the printing operation was running almost non-stop. Stacks of counterfeit 20s were packaged, bundled, and moved through multiple intermediaries before entering circulation throughout Canada and the United States. At the same time, the psychological pressure on Frank was becoming impossible to ignore. He grew increasingly paranoid. While driving, he constantly checked his mirrors and changed routes without warning. If the same vehicle appeared behind him more than once, he would deliberately alter direction just to see whether he was being followed. Frank also stopped keeping sensitive materials at home and tried separating his personal life from the counterfeit operation as much as possible. But no matter how careful he became, he understood the reality of the situation. An operation producing hundreds of millions of dollars in counterfeit U.S. currency could not remain invisible forever. By early 2012, Frank had started thinking seriously about getting out. The longer the operation continued, the higher the chances of arrest became. Some lower-level distributors connected to the network had already attracted investigative attention, reinforcing Frank's belief that authorities were getting closer to the primary source. But just as he began considering an exit strategy, a new buyer approached him with an offer to purchase a massive quantity of counterfeit cash. Frank agreed to the meeting. It would become the single biggest mistake of the entire operation. The first meeting was arranged at a cafe in Montreal in March of 2012. Frank arrived the same way he always did, clean-cut, calm, carefully dressed, trying to look like an ordinary businessman meeting a client. But the moment he walked inside, something felt off. The new buyer seemed unusually calm. Too calm. The way he spoke felt different from the criminals Frank had dealt with before. Less emotional. Less aggressive. More controlled. Frank couldn't explain exactly what bothered him, but the feeling stayed with him throughout the meeting. The buyer requested an initial order of $100,000 in counterfeit currency as a quality test. If everything checked out, they would move forward with much larger purchases. Frank understood the logic. Most criminal groups tested product quality before committing to larger transactions. Even though his instincts told him something wasn't right, suddenly backing out could create suspicion, or worse. The two men eventually agreed to complete the exchange in the parking lot of a shopping center. What Frank didn't know was that the entire cafe meeting had already been secretly recorded. The buyer was cooperating with federal investigators. The first delivery took place later that evening. Frank arrived driving a rented SUV, carrying a bag filled with approximately $100,000 in counterfeit $20 bills. Even after years of illegal transactions, he appeared more nervous than usual. When he reached the parking lot, he didn't get out immediately. Instead, Frank slowly circled the area multiple times, watching the surrounding vehicles carefully. He paid close attention to cars parked too long in certain spots and looked for any sign of surveillance activity. After spotting nothing obvious, he finally proceeded with the exchange. The buyer quickly inspected several bills under UV light before handing over a separate bag containing legitimate cash payment. The meeting lasted only a few minutes. Then both vehicles drove away in opposite directions. Shortly after the first transaction, the buyer contacted Frank again. He claimed the counterfeit money had exceeded expectations and asked to arrange another deal the very next day. Same quantity, same setup. That was the detail that worried Frank most. Two large back-to-back transactions with a brand new buyer created exactly the kind of risk he had spent years trying to avoid. Throughout the operation, Frank had always been careful about patterns. Anything unusual meant danger. But in the end, he agreed to the second deal anyway. Partly because of the money, and partly because Frank still believed his caution and experience were enough to keep him safe. What he didn't know was that immediately after the first exchange, investigators had already begun monitoring his movements. After the first transaction with a new buyer, Canadian investigators working alongside the United States Secret Service began expanding surveillance on Frank Barasa. Their objective was no longer just catching him passing counterfeit currency. They wanted the entire operation. The production system, the printing equipment, the storage locations, and whatever counterfeit cash had not yet entered circulation. The second transaction was scheduled for the following day in the same shopping center parking lot. As usual, Frank followed his routine before approaching the buyer. He drove multiple laps around the area, constantly checking his mirrors and searching for signs of surveillance. But this time, the operation tracking him was far more sophisticated. Investigators used unmarked civilian vehicles positioned far enough away to avoid attracting suspicion. Above them, a surveillance helicopter monitored the rented SUV Frank was driving, ensuring agents would not lose sight of him even if ground teams had to back off. After completing the exchange, Frank left the parking lot and immediately began changing directions repeatedly. He moved through different streets, doubled back unexpectedly, and made sudden turns to see whether any vehicles remained behind him. It was a counter-surveillance habit he had developed over years of illegal activity. But investigators had prepared for exactly that. Whenever ground units had to create distance, the helicopter maintained visual contact from above and continuously relayed Frank's location to teams below. After nearly an hour of driving, Frank eventually returned to a rural residential property in Quebec where he lived with his girlfriend. Investigators quickly documented the address and continued covert surveillance over the following weeks. They didn't want to move too early. Agents believed Frank was still hiding a much larger quantity of counterfeit currency somewhere else. Arresting him immediately after the transaction could allow critical evidence and potentially the remaining production network to disappear before authorities could recover it. As surveillance continued, the psychological pressure on Frank became increasingly visible. Late at night, he often stood near the windows watching the street outside the house. He paid close attention to unfamiliar vehicles parked nearby for too long. At times, Frank even used binoculars to scan the surrounding area because he had become convinced he was being watched. His girlfriend noticed the growing tension but had no idea what was actually happening behind the scenes. According to investigative records, authorities continued gathering photographs, tracking movement patterns, and preparing search warrant applications. By early May 2012, investigators believed they finally had enough evidence to move in. The raid was scheduled for pre-dawn hours to reduce the risk of Frank destroying evidence or attempting to resist arrest. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, multiple police vehicles and SWAT units arrived outside the suburban home where Frank was sleeping. Officers quickly surrounded the property before using a battering ram to force entry into the house. Frank had almost no time to react. He was pulled from bed and handcuffed in front of his girlfriend while investigators began searching the garage, basement, and other sections of the property. What authorities discovered inside immediately confirmed the true scale of the operation. Hidden throughout the residence and connected locations were industrial offset printers, security paper, unfinished print sheets, counterfeit production equipment, and nearly $1 million in completed counterfeit currency. Investigators also recovered a small quantity of marijuana from the bedroom. After years spent tracking the source of the supernotes circulating across Canada and the United States, authorities had finally identified the man behind one of the largest counterfeit currency operations in modern North American history. But at that moment, investigators still didn't realize something critical. Frank Barasa was hiding an even larger stockpile of counterfeit money somewhere else. After the raid in May 2012, Frank Barasa was officially taken into custody with overwhelming evidence linking him to a massive counterfeit currency operation. For U.S. investigators, this was no longer viewed as an ordinary counterfeiting case. For years, the Secret Service had been tracking the appearance of high-quality supernotes circulating across North America without identifying the true source behind them. Now, they finally had the man believed to be running the entire operation. Almost immediately after Frank's arrest, U.S. authorities began preparing extradition paperwork. If transferred to the United States for trial, Frank could potentially face decades in federal prison, possibly even life-equivalent sentencing, because of the enormous scale of the counterfeit network. Frank understood that perfectly. During the years he spent building the operation, he had studied how American financial investigations worked. He knew that once inside the U.S. federal system, the chances of ever returning to a normal life were extremely small. In the first days after his arrest, Frank made little effort to deny the evidence seized by investigators. The printing equipment, the security paper, the counterfeit production materials, the nearly $1 million in fake currency recovered during the raid. It was already enough to establish his central role in the operation. But Frank still possessed something investigators did not. Approximately $200 million in counterfeit currency that authorities had not yet located. According to later investigative records, most of the counterfeit cash produced by Frank had never been recovered during the initial raid. The money had been hidden in secret storage locations known only to him. That became Frank's most valuable bargaining chip. Through his attorneys, he offered full cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing and protection from extradition to the United States. Frank agreed to surrender the remaining counterfeit currency, provide technical details about the production process, turn over digital design files, explain the manufacturing methods, and help investigators understand how the distribution network operated. For investigators, the offer carried enormous value. The unrecovered counterfeit currency represented a serious threat to the financial system. If Frank refused to cooperate and received a lengthy prison sentence, hundreds of millions of dollars in fake U.S. currency could continue circulating for years through existing criminal distribution channels. Eventually, authorities accepted the deal. In June 2012, under police supervision, Frank led investigators to a secret storage facility near Montreal. When the warehouse doors opened, investigators were reportedly stunned by what they saw inside. Cardboard boxes were stacked from floor to near ceiling height. Inside them were tightly packaged bundles of counterfeit $20 bills wrapped in massive quantities. Authorities spent days counting and cataloging the evidence. The final estimate revealed approximately $200 million in counterfeit currency had been recovered, not including unfinished print sheets, digital production files, and additional manufacturing equipment. Investigators later described it as one of the largest counterfeit currency seizures in modern Canadian history. What surprised many people most was the way Frank handled himself after the arrest. He didn't behave like a typical street-level criminal. He acted more like a businessman negotiating the final terms of a contract. Frank understood that what authorities needed most was not simply a conviction. They needed the counterfeit system itself recovered before the remaining money could spread further into circulation. That leverage ultimately helped him avoid extradition to the United States. In July 2012, Frank Barasa appeared in court in Quebec and pleaded guilty to reduced charges as part of his cooperation agreement. The final outcome shocked many people following the case. After operating a counterfeit network believed to involve roughly $250 million in fake U.S. currency, Frank received a sentence of only 6 weeks in jail along with a $1,350 fine related to marijuana possession. Some people inside the courtroom reportedly struggled to believe the sentence they had just heard announced. When the trial ended in 2012, many people struggled to believe the final outcome of the case. Frank Barasa, the man believed to be behind a counterfeit currency network worth roughly $250 million, received only 6 weeks in jail along with a $1,350 fine tied to marijuana possession. By cooperating with investigators and surrendering nearly $200 million in counterfeit currency, along with the technical details behind the production process, Frank had successfully avoided extradition to the United States. Had he been transferred to the U.S. court system, he likely would have faced decades behind bars. After his release, Frank's life changed completely. The scale of the case quickly pushed his name into newspapers, financial crime documentaries, and investigative television programs across North America. But what made the story even stranger was that Frank didn't disappear from public view after leaving jail. Instead, he re-emerged in an entirely different role: a counterfeit detection expert. Banks and financial institutions became increasingly interested in understanding how Frank had managed to create supernotes capable of bypassing most routine counterfeit inspections. The same knowledge that once helped him operate one of the most sophisticated counterfeit networks in modern history had suddenly become valuable to the financial security industry. Frank began appearing at conferences and speaking events, explaining counterfeit printing techniques and exposing weaknesses in counterfeit detection systems at the time. Some reports later suggested he earned significant amounts of money through consulting work and public speaking, in some cases even more than he had earned while running his legitimate brake pad business years earlier. But despite avoiding a lengthy prison sentence, Frank still paid a heavy price for what he had done. Because of his role in a large-scale counterfeit operation targeting U.S. currency, he was permanently banned from entering the United States. For someone who once distributed fake American money throughout North America, being locked out of the world's largest economy carried serious consequences. The case also severely damaged his personal life. Later reports and documentaries reveal that Frank's girlfriend was shocked when she discovered the truth behind the operation he had secretly been running for years. According to information released after the trial, she appeared to have little understanding of the true scale of the counterfeit network hidden behind Frank's everyday life. After the case ended, the relationship was never the same. What fascinated many people most about Frank Barasa was the way he viewed himself. He never fit the image of a traditional violent